When the First World War was beginning to draw to a close around 1917-1918, a mood of introspection had gripped Europe. This was because the war that began in 1914 and lasted for over 3.5 years was perhaps the severest round of warfare that Europe had experienced in several centuries. And there was a mood of introspection, therefore, as to why an event that affected only one of the major powers of Europe, Austria-Hungary, managed to conflagrate Europe as a whole. How is it that the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary by a fanatic from Serbia managed to involve Germany, Russia, France, and Britain into a general warfare that damaged a full generation and ruined all the imperial formations of Europe? And the result of this mood of introspection came down as a harsh critique of the practice of diplomacy that characterized Europe in the second half of the 19th century. There was this understanding that the manner in which Europe had become virtually divided into two armed camps, with Germany and Austria-Hungary on the one hand, France, Britain, and Russia reigned on the other. Any conflict involving a member of each camp was almost inevitably going to drag all the others. Subsequently, historians dealing with this question have in the main accepted this general argument about division of Europe into two armed camps. Nevertheless, they like to point out that this division of Europe to armed camps, the manner in which this idea of a division of Europe into two armed camps appeared in 1918, was probably far less simplistic than what it was made it to appear in contemporary observations. The idea that the division was very rigid and that conflict was inevitable if it involved any two members was considered to be very, very superfluous and completely unmindful of the various nuances that can be said to were being in play in the international arena around this point of time. There was, however, a general agreement that the constitution of two major strategic alignments, known by their shorthands as the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, were pivotal in defining the trajectory in the making of the Great War. What appeared to the Europeans of those days as Europe divided firmly as two armed camps, one has to bear in mind, was a result of a series of developments that had been taking place in course of the 4.5 decades that preceded the outset of the First War. It could be said to have begun in German victory over, or Prussian victory over Austria in the Battle of Sadowa in 1866, followed after 4 years by the German defeat of France at the Battle of Sedan in 1870. In these two major decisive victories, first of Prussia and then Germany led by Prussia, the balance of power that had been brought into being by the Vienna Congress in 1815 was decidedly reversed. For the first time, balance of power in the 19th century Europe shifted from Paris and Vienna to the new capital of Berlin. The Bismarckian era, when it began in 1871, ushered in a series of impulses along which Europe was to play for the next 4.5 decades. Bismarck had come up with this very interesting formulation that in a Europe inhabited by 5 powers, you must always be a part of a troika. That is to say, in a Europe where 5 powers are at play, everyone should attempt or everyone should try to be on the side on which there are 3 powers. And with this aim in mind, Bismarck had set out the principal foreign policy agenda of Bismarckian Germany to be keeping France isolated. Because of Germany's recent victory over France, as also Germany's acquisition of Alsace-Lorraine from France after almost a millennia of conflict over the region, it was reasonably certain that in any diplomatic formulation in in Europe, Germany and France could not be long-term allies. Germany and France would in fact be fairly, in the medium term, inimical towards each other. So Bismarck's aim at keeping France isolated was particularly significant in defining the trajectory along which both Berlin and Paris were to move in the next 4.5 decades. Bismarck's aim was then to win over other powers to its diplomatic on its side in terms of diplomacy. Now, Britain in the second half of the 19th century, at least till 1870s, was very decidedly perfectly happy to remain aloof. Britain did not covet an inch of European soil, so Britain had no problem with accepting whichever power was on the dominant, provided its domination was not going to challenge British hegemony of the globe in any way. So with France unreconcilable and Britain unwilling to be aligned, Bismarck had only Austria-Hungary and Russia to take care of. Now, the Prussian defeat of Austria had led to a brief period of rancor between Berlin and Vienna. But by the early 1870s, Austria was, as it were, moving back into the fold of its natural alignment that they existed between the German-speaking states. So Berlin and Vienna began to grow diplomatically closer once it was made perfectly clear that Berlin's star was on the rise. On the other hand, Russia had been diplomatically close to Berlin for at least the decade that went before it, before 1871. So Bismarck's challenge was primarily to keep these two powers together. There was one problem, and this was, while both considered Berlin to be its friend, none of them considered each other to be their own friends. There was no mutual friendship between Vienna and St. Petersburg. This was because Russian policy of advancing towards warm waters, towards the Mediterranean, involved her into an expansionist policy in the Balkans. And this was unwelcome to Austria-Hungary because of a very simple reason, that there were nationalist elements in Austria-Hungary that would get a fillip if there were to be emergent Slavic states that Russia seemed to want in the Balkan regions. So, given the mutually opposed character of Russo-Austrian interests in the Balkans, it was very difficult to hold the two together. In order to manage this, Bismarck decided to launch on what was known as the Three Emperors League, or the Dreikaiserbund. The foundational principle of the Dreikaiserbund had been very simple, that there would be diplomatic attempts at resolving all possible disputes that might emerge between the three powers, so that if there was to be actually any clash of interests between, say, the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians, the first shot would be given not of the grape shot, but of diplomatic negotiations. And in this manner, the Dreikaiserbund was meant to harmonize the interests of two completely antagonistic powers in such a manner that Bismarck could prevent either of them from drifting away into the orbit that France might be willing to generate. And in some respects, the Dreikaiserbund was working, because when the Balkan crisis erupted in 1874-75 over the affair of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Vienna and St. Petersburg actually negotiated and discussed the manner in which Russia would intervene in the course of the crisis. Now, as it so happened that in course of the war that followed in 1876-77, Russia managed to sort of bulldoze the Ottoman army out of its positions of resistance, and was in a position to dictate terms in the Treaty of San Stefano, which led to the proposal for the creation of a big state of Bulgaria, of a very large state of Bulgaria. Now, this being unacceptable to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this was resisted, and because Britain was also adamant that the Ottoman Empire had to be maintained in its shape, that its unity and integrity had to be retained at all costs, the diplomatic fracas that broke out resulted ultimately in the Berlin Congress, which was in fact the greatest test to which the Dreikaiserbund was put. Bismarck could ultimately not satisfy Russia in any major way, and the decision was taken to dismantle Bulgaria in a manner that Vienna proposed. Now, historians have subsequently looked at the reason why Bismarck came down on the side of Vienna rather than St. Petersburg, and the general agreement has been that it was a solidarity of the German-speaking people that was working. There was also, however, a deeper argument made by people like Hagen Schulz and Fritz Fischer and Immanuel Geis, which suggest that Bismarck's choice of Austria-Hungary at this point of time was driven by its economic considerations that was before the German Reich, and the need to dominate the economy of the Danubian principalities, which was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, made Bismarck choose Vienna over St. Petersburg. If we leave aside the exact motivations of German behavior behind the Berlin Congress and take the substance of it, that Bismarck preferred Austria-Hungary, this goes on to explain why in 1879 a dual alliance was actually forged with Vienna. Between Berlin and Vienna, the dual alliance that was signed in 1879 was a secret treaty with a very clear set of protocols laying down the terms on which the alignment was made. To start with, the dual alliance was a military strategic alignment which pivoted on German support for Austria in case Russia was to declare war against Austria-Hungary, in return for Austro-Hungarian support for Germany in case France was to declare war against Germany. So, Germany and Austria-Hungary were proposing to come to each other's military aid if either of them were victims of aggression, respectively by France and Russia. Which also meant, and this is what historians have emphasized in the recent times, that Bismarck was not guaranteeing Vienna a blank check in the Balkans. Any Austro-Hungarian ambition would be severely discouraged because the alignment was basically a defensive alliance. It works only if the signatory is being attacked. If the signatory was to engage in military adventurism, it would not hold. This dual alliance of 1879, historians of diplomatic history have subsequently identified as the foundation stone of dividing Europe into two armed camps, because it was forging a very strong axis between Berlin and Vienna, which was never to break till the coming of the First World War. Because Berlin remained a staunch ally of Austria-Hungary, sometimes it managed to discourage Austria-Hungary from playing a rash hand in the Balkans, but by and large this axis held. It was also pivotal, the dual alliance was also pivotal in helping Russia determine its course of actions, because at a time when the Berlin settlement proved to Russia that it was still open to a continental solidarity against the policies of St. Petersburg, Russia immediately decided to ignore Bismarck's favoring of Austria-Hungary and attempting to coming close, and Russia attempted to come close to Berlin once again. And Bismarck, in fact, was only too happy to bring Russia back on board, because it would guarantee the fact that Russia and France would not be able to come close to each other. It was primarily with this aim in mind that the Dreikaiserverhältnis, or the Three Emperors League, was reinstated, but this time around far more definite provisions, which meant that if, or which stipulated that if either of the signatories, either of the three signatories were to go to war with a fourth power, then the other two would remain basically neutral. This was an indicative of Russian concern that if a Crimean coalition was to be attempted to be revived by Britain or France, Austria-Hungary and Germany would stay neutral. If Russia was to go to war against the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburgs and the Germans would remain neutral. In return, of course, if France went to war with Germany, Russia was meant to remain neutral. By this time, the realization was reasonably clear, reasonably adequate in Berlin, that there could be no long-term compatibility between the interests of St. Petersburg and the interests of Vienna vis-a-vis the Balkans. And there was therefore always that potential that Russia would drift away into the ambit that France inhabits, and Bismarck therefore was plagued by the prospect of being flanked on either side by a power that could potentially at some point of time declare war on Germany. So Bismarck, as A.G.P. Taylor went on to argue, faced with a point where out of the five major powers of Europe, three may not be aligned with Germany, went on to invent a sixth great power, which was Italy. And this was how the Triple Alliance actually came to be forged, because in 1882-83 a treaty was signed between Vienna, Berlin and Rome, which stipulated German assistance to Italy if Italy was attacked by France. In return, Italy would stay neutral. In this manner, Bismarck was trying to sort of limit the possibility of opening up a second front, both in case of an Austro-Hungarian war with Russia as also in case of a Franco-German war. And the invention of Italy as the third partner in the Triple Alliance, who did not actually even feature among the five great powers, was in some ways an admission of a diplomatic impossibility that he had earlier ventured out with. Nevertheless, Bismarck tried till his last, as we know, to keep Russia on board. The Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 was basically meant to ensure that in any conflict involving Russia and Austria-Hungary, Germany could not be easily dragged in, nor, in fact, in any conflict between Germany and France, Russia would be inevitably dragged in. This was a very tight alliance, 1887, but the problem was this now had to be time bound, because by this time St. Petersburg was no longer certain that Germany was the power to align with. The reason why St. Petersburg was more suspicious of German aims or German objectives than it used to be in the 1870s was that by this time Russia had embarked on a policy of industrialization, and Russia needed capital to be raised in the European money markets, and if the German money market would lend the money to Russia, then life would have become easier. Nevertheless, Bismarck, under pressure from the German money market and the German industrial market, blocked the attempts, because a flourishing Russian industry could emerge as a competitor of the German industry, and also it would involve the loss of Russian market for industrial goods. So economic as well as strategic compulsions were beginning to push Russia away from Germany, and the Russian thirst for capital was in the early 1890s beginning to be met increasingly by the French capital market. This drew Russia into a closer embrace with France, and between 1891 and 94, France and Russia entered first into economic, then into political, and finally into strategic alignment. The Treaty of 1894 locking France and Russia into tight embrace in terms of their military and strategic commitments towards each other in case of a war with either Germany or Austria-Hungary makes a very clear reading as to why the alignment took the form that it did. So by 1894, we have a situation where along a central axis between Berlin and Vienna, another axis came at cross purposes, which was involving the flanking powers of France on the one hand and Russia on the other. So of the 5 powers in European international arena, 4 were already aligned by 1894. For Britain, the policy was fairly simple. Britain coveted not an inch on European soil for near about 3 centuries by this time. Britain had its global colonial empire to sustain it. And for Britain, the principal consideration was maintaining that colonial empire which guaranteed Britain global hegemony. In the second half of the 19th century, as whole of Europe began to industrialize and Britain was steadily losing one industrial market after the other in the continent of Europe, British dependence on its colonies began to grow. By the 1850, it was absolutely pivotal for British global hegemony to have an unrestricted, unhindered access to the jewel in the British crown, that was India. As a result, British imperial and strategic doctrine around this point of time revolved around safeguarding all possible passages to India. There were 2 major fallouts of this kind of understanding of where British interests lay. One was any eastward expansion by Russia, any Asia-ward expansion by Russia was bound to be considered a threat by the British. Now the Russians, to be fair, were not even considering threatening the British Empire. Their principal concern was to reach the warm waters of the Mediterranean and of the Arabian Sea or the Indian Ocean. So the Russians began to expand into the Caucasus and the Caspian region in the early 19th century, and then gradually began to penetrate into Persia and Afghanistan in the second half of the 19th century. Aim being primarily to reach the coastline of Arabian Sea, which would give them access to ports that are not frozen around the year. But this was considered to be a major threat, major challenge by the Brits. So the British began to contest Russia wherever and whenever this was necessary. Additionally, French penetration of Africa in the second half of the 19th century required that the British would contest them as well, because the French agenda of annexing the entire swathe of Africa, spreading between Senegal in the west and the eastern coast of Africa and Somalia, Eritrea region, so that they could reach up to the port of Aden, which was a French strategic significance to the French, was considered to be directly inimical to British Africa policy, which required a continuous and unhindered control over the region between Cape of Good Hope and Cairo, which is the policy of Cape to Cairo as we know of it. The British began to fight in Africa against the French to start with, but by the early 20th century also against the Germans, because the British considered Africa to be of strategic significance because it lent strategic depth to British domination of the Indian Ocean and therefore the access to India. Having therefore France and Russia as its principal adversaries, Britain in the early 1890s decided to align with Germany, or attempt to align with Germany. Now Germany was more than happy to oblige, but Germany had one principal condition, that there was to be definite military commitment in defending Germany against Franco-Russian attacks, invasions, or warfare. This Britain was not willing to commit to. So Germany decided that it would have to be strong enough for Britain to accept Germany on its terms. In the later years of the 1890s, Germany began a program of naval buildup, which, incidentally, the British began to feel threatened by. So Britain urged Germany to put a cap on its naval buildup. And when Germany spurned the offer, Britain suspected that there were deeper forces at play, and the idea of Weltpolitik, Britain began to interpret German doctrine of Weltpolitik enunciated by Kaiser Wilhelm II, Britain began to interpret as a challenge to British global hegemony. With this understanding of German ambition, which was to an extent flawed, Britain went on to align first with France, then with Russia. At that stage, one could argue that the Triple Entente was formed. The Triple Entente, unlike the Triple Alliance, was not meant to be a military alignment. But because of the trajectory that followed this, the formation of the Triple Entente, the entire situation began to rapidly deteriorate and slide towards the war. Because the Germans, when they saw that Britain, France and Russia was coming together, they began to feel encircled, they began to feel threatened. And they tried to test the limits of this Triple Entente as far as possible, and they embarked on a policy of brinkmanship in foreign policy. It was this German brinkmanship that one could argue ultimately solidified and militarized the Triple Entente and gave an impression on the eve of the Great War that Europe was actually divided into two armed camps. From that point of time, as mutual commitments began to be much more solid, much more concrete, the slide towards the Great War was simply an inevitable trajectory. The countdown to the war had begun.